So one of the things that we wanted to do next, we hope that that was a helpful sort of foundation of sort of the key elements of the formula and how they work. One of the things we did want to do next is sort of take a look at real data and take a look at, okay, we've heard about how this works, let's put it to actual use and see how this works. And so this slide here is simply a modeled example of how the formula would actually work in two different communities. I picked Middletown for you, Senator Palma, and Providence for you, Senator Metz. And I figured you'd both be interested in that. But essentially what this goes to show is you'll recall that there are, for what we call the total foundation aid, right, which is the core costs that actually go into teaching and learning in a district. Not the non-core costs, so not utilities and transportation and food service, just the core. And what this gives is a sample student in Middletown versus Providence that is receiving both the core and is identified as in poverty, so is receiving the student success factor. And so again, some students would receive this, right? So every district has a certain number of their students that are receiving the higher amount with the success factor. And then there are typically a lot more students, depending on the district, that are receiving the base amount. So this just assumes they get both to sort of illustrate the point. Middletown's state share ratio is 31% and Providence is 87%. And you see how it's intended in the formula to make sure that even though the funding sources change between differences from where the money comes from, that ultimately that amount remains the same. And so what you'll see is the bottom blue part is the core base amount that is the state's share. So you'll see in Providence, the state pays a significantly greater portion of that core amount, and in Middletown, the local town pays a significantly more amount than that core. So the blue and the red ultimately add up to the same, but you can see that there's a difference between the state picking up cost and the city or town picking up cost. That then just continues through the green and the purple boxes, right? So the student success factor is funded at the same level, but again, in Middletown, the green, there's a much smaller state share and the local picks up the purple. And then in Providence, you can see that that has happened, okay? Now, one of the things that we've talked a lot about around why this is a opportune time to take a review and look at the formula is because we knew that when the formula was passed, that many districts were underfunded and some were overfunded according to the state share that the formula would say. And so for districts that were underfunded, the state committed to 7 years to bring up the state share. That has now happened, right? So the state is now fully funding its obligation under the formula for these students, either the core, the base core, or even the core plus the student success factor. Some districts are still actually receiving a little bit more, right? So there's 10 years on the phase down. So there are some districts that are receiving a little bit more than this of the state share as those final adjustments come in the last couple fiscal years here. On the local side, there actually was no mandate within the enabling with the original law that required the local cities or towns to meet these numbers, have a goal to hit these numbers. There was no requirement. And so one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we took a look at was, okay, with the state's obligation now fully phased in, where are we at? Are we actually hitting the points that we wanted to in making sure that the core amount was available for every student and the core amount plus the student success factor was available for every student identified in one of these poverty thresholds. So that's sort of the illustration that's meaning to show there. Okay. So as we sort of go further a little bit, we tried to sort of take out, and for the committee members, there's a nice giant spreadsheet in front of all of you that has a lot of small numbers. But what we tried to do is pull out some of the key points that may be of interest to the committee as we go. And so the first thing that we realized when looking at the formula is the equity level that was intended to be received that we just saw in the prior chart is not received today, or at least all this data is as of fiscal year 18. It's the latest that's available. And so for these communities, there are still 3 communities across the state where the full core funding amount is not reaching those communities. And so if you see it's Woonsocket, Pawtucket, and Providence. The numbers of the overall are obviously interesting, but even more important is what does that mean on a per pupil basis, right? So how much per student are we not providing the resources at that level? And so you can see Woonsocket is the greatest at 2,336 short per student, Pawtucket 1,507, and Providence at 281. Because of the design of the formula and the state share now being fully phased in, we can now pretty easily trace back. When we had done this analysis a couple of years ago, we had to figure out how much was the state underfunding versus how much the local was underfunding. But with the state share now fully phased in, this would all be the local share as envisioned under the formula that's causing some of these variances. We talked a lot about the student success factor, and we talked a lot about how it was designed to meet the needs of the communities that have or of the students rather, that have additional needs, whether it be a special education, poverty, English language learner. All of those things were deemed to be requiring additional support financially to be able to support those students. And so, again, 3 communities are popping out as not funding that student success factor. So if you look at Woonsocket, in order to fund that amount in the city of Woonsocket for those students with higher needs, you would need about $16 million. Actually funded is about $2.6 million, so only 16% funded. You see Pawtucket, 24 million would be the number, only 11 is funded, and in Providence, 71 would be the number, only 65 is funded. And so when you add up those numbers, you can see that they quickly grow in those communities to the tens of millions of dollars that we're not seeing, as the formula intended, those student success factor dollars reaching those students. One of the things that I think is, kind of double downing on this point is that 70% of the state's ELL population and 45% of the state's students in poverty are in those 3 districts. So if the student success factor dollars are not reaching those districts, we shouldn't be surprised when we talk about achievement and we consistently see that among the subgroup of ELL learners that we're not meeting the achievement gains that we had asked for, when our own formula that says this is the resources that will be needed to educate those students is not actually reaching those students. And so it's a very important point because I think we talk a lot about the results of RICAS when they come out, and we look at those groups, and that is also, right, those results have also driven us to now create a categorical fund. The categorical fund was created under the auspices that there were additional monies needed above and beyond what was in the formula, but these numbers clearly show that even the base numbers in the formula were not there. And so, and a categorical of 5 million is certainly not going to mask an underlying problem to the tens of millions to meet that need. So the categorical itself is a little incongruent to the formula's goal, but also I think the 5 million really shows just the insignificance of that amount of money towards what is a multi-tens of million dollar problem in those communities. Continuing there, and I apologize for Senator Murray for being the star of the show this evening. So in addition to sort of looking at those communities, you'll recall that on the core expenses, the state share, there's a state share. The state helps and assists and pays the core expenses. For non-core expenses, they are supposed to be 100% paid with local resources. There was one community in the state where the local share was not even enough to cover the non-core expenses, and so in the city of Woonsocket's case, $3.9 million of the state money meant for core is actually being diverted and spent on non-core instruction or non-core expenses in the city of Woonsocket. Another thing for us to look at, and this will be a topic of a future hearing, is what we look at on these non-core expenses. And so this is a listing, and it's sorted by highest to lowest of non-core expense. And so if you think about non-core expenses, right? Transportation, food service, energy. These are outside of the classroom expenses, and these are things where we want to be as efficient as we possibly can. And oftentimes, the bigger the district, the more economies of scale and efficiency they should receive, given when you buy these services, typically the more you buy, the better price that you get. And so one of these things that we do want to make sure that we take a deeper look at is when looking at these efficiency ratios here around the non-core expenses, some districts are out of whack in spending significantly more than the state average. And if you think about it, every dollar that you can save on a non-core expense is a dollar that could go into a core expense, which is meaning it's going to a teacher, it's going to curriculum, it's going to something actually happening in the classroom. This is a completely imperfect way to look at this, and I'll point out a few examples. If you look at the highest non-core spending districts, you'll clearly see that you're going to get some of the smaller districts that are in there who may just be struggling to reach those economies of scale that you would normally see. And so that'd be common. Other things is when Woonsocket comes up high on this percent of their money going to non-core expenses, it may just be a function that their overall spending is significantly lower, so it makes their percent of non-core go up. So there certainly are a lot of nuanced details to these numbers, but I think certainly worth something for us to look into. If you think about Providence, the biggest district in the state, middle to higher of spending the amount of their spending on non-core, if we could get them down to the state average, that could be millions of dollars that could be diverted and sent to their core funding. So just an area for us to continue to look at as we go forward. Senator Satchel.
What's the state average?
About 27%.
Jim?
Yes.
With regard to this chart, and I got a more general question later on, if I assume there's a breakdown, there's a decomposition of the total, because it's made up, like you said, those things. It's transportation, it's back from office services, et cetera.
Yeah.
Because it might shed some, I don't know that it will. I think I'm always a firm believer that facts and data tell a story. You got to go find the story and what it's telling you. If you look at the top level numbers, it's not good or bad. It could be good or bad, but if you look at the lower level numbers, maybe more insightful. Can we get those details that make up the total numbers to try and look at some of that, to try and say, oh, that number's there, and go ask, well, why is that number like it is?
Yep. Senator, I think that's a very good point, and it is absolutely one of the topics that we have on the agenda for the future. We've, again, RIDE has been a great partner in helping to look at this and help us thinking about it. One of the things that RIDE is doing is taking a look at the spending profiles of all districts in the state on both core and non-core to find out where those variances are and who's spending more where. And again, we don't know what that's going to tell us, but I think we've agreed that by pulling the data back and looking into it a bit more, I think we'll hopefully find some storylines there that we can tease out.
Thank you.
Sure. And then one of the other things that we continue to see, and this really is a view on the charter tuition aid. So charter tuitions are considered a non-core expense, and so one of the things that we look at when we kind of take a look at this is, we talked earlier about the core amount being underfunded in certain communities. One of the base assumptions of the formula when it comes to charter aid, or charter tuitions rather, is that the formula is fully funded because the state share of that aid is withheld and sent directly to that charter, and then the district has to take what their local share is and send over a check for that as well. And so given the conversations around 1,000-seat expansion in Providence, I think it was important to sort of show just the math, right? What does the math tell us about the way our own formula would view this change? And so what we've done here is we've modeled out what does Providence look like, and it says today, but it's really fiscal year 18, and what would it be if 1,000 charter seats were added to the city of Providence? And so you can see how the math pans out. So you can see the enrollment change between the district enrollment and the charter enrollment. You can see the tuition change. That tuition change is the expense change that's modeled here. And you can see the state aid reduction. So the first thing to look at is if you see the expense goes up 4.2 million, the state aid goes down 10.7, the net number that you're looking for there is $15 million. And so in order for this to be a break-even change for the city schools, the city would have to find $15 million within their existing budget to cut. What you'll see a little bit further down below, when you see the blue line that starts to go on the foundation amount, the funding formula model is that by losing those 1,000 students from a core and student success factor basis, the city's obligation would only come down $12.3 million. So you can see how there's there's a differential there between the 15 and the 12.3 that would have to be offset with additional expense reductions, either in core or non-core expenses, to make those changes. And so it's definitely something that I think we have to be cognizant of, particularly as a lot of the charter concentration is in some of those districts we identified earlier as being the ones remaining with a core gap, because you can see the net effect in the bottom line of this chart is the core gap per student under this scenario grows from $281 per student to $419 per student. So net for the students remaining within that district, if the city can't find that full $15 million in reduction, that's the reality of what plays out. And then finally, just as an overview here, but all of the members certainly have this in front of you, this is just a summary of every district in the state and where they stand overall on meeting the core foundation amount that we've been talking about this evening. And so you can see the three on the top that we've been talking a little bit more. And then you start with Central Falls being the first one that hits the number, almost nearly on the head. And then you can see throughout the differences here, the amount spent per student, amount available, the resources per student vary quite greatly between communities. And so you can see, you get all the way up to, obviously New Shoreham is an outlier, given, I forget their enrollment, but it's quite small. And, with Narragansett, overall, having an additional $6,000 per student above the core, what the state would do. And that's certainly a local decision. Every city or town can make the decision as to how much more they want to support education. I think, as you look at these numbers, there certainly are some correlations to performance. And so, South Kingstown has consistently been seen as a district in the state well on the move and doing well. And they certainly have the resources to do so. And so I think this is a good snapshot to really put in perspective, as the RICAS results will be coming out. I think this is a really good view to keep the funding level in perspective with the results that we have across the state. So with that said, if there are any questions from members on any of those slides, Senator Powell?
Just go back one chart and then I have just a comment at the end. So I concur with you with regards to the difference in the dollar amounts. But there's expected to be some, I don't want to use the word efficiencies, some reductions in cost. We're not going to, it's not 1,000 students divided by 15, 20 per class, whatever the negotiated contract is in Providence per class on per age group, and that's the number, because they're going to be in different pockets in different places, et cetera. But we've also heard recently from the commissioner and others that there may be too many schools in Providence, right? So at the end of the day, some of those costs Providence has of buildings is a part of it as well.
I think the bottom line is if you can hit 15 million, then it's neutral. If you can't hit 15 million,
you got to address it somehow.
You've done it though. But I think it's important to set that target, right?
Yep.
To know here's the impact,
right?
And so therefore, if we want it to be a cost neutral impact, we need to find $15 million in expense reduction. If we can find it, then fine. But if not, then you're just digging the hole.
You got to address something. You got to address it somehow. Just the last slide.
One before.
The very last slide. Sorry. And just more of a general comment, as you mentioned earlier, I don't have it in front of me, but I remember looking at it a while back. So as we went to MCAS to RICAS, and we were looking at the funding formula that Massachusetts has, if I recall correctly, I'm not saying this is desirable, but when somebody says we want to be like Massachusetts, well, I believe in Massachusetts, they have in their Mass General Law, I was going to say Rhode Island General Law in Massachusetts, but in General Law, Massachusetts has a statement of fact, or a statement that says the state will articulate and determine what your local share is to education as a prescribed part of, if it's $10, you're paying $10. It's not, I want to pay $9.50 this year and $10.50, a minimum amount, not necessarily a prescribed number, but you can do more. But I think that's correct.
That is true. They do issue, similar to how we have a local share here that we've implied, but we've never enforced, right? Massachusetts does enforce that, and they also do have additional mechanisms that if the local city or town is unable or they force them to come up with a plan to meet that number, and the state actually supplants that aid until the city or town gets there. So they do force it, and if they need some time, the state actually supplants that need.
Okay. Thank you.